Welcome to Not Just a Story with Rose Davidson, where lived experience becomes meaning and stories create impact.
There are moments when writing a post isn't enough. There are moments when sharing another statistic isn't enough. There are moments when reading about another woman killed by someone who supposedly loved her makes you stop and think, what are we actually doing? Not what are we saying, not what are we promising, not what committee is meeting next month or what report is being commissioned. What are we actually doing? And that's where I found myself recently. I sat down and wrote an open letter to the Prime Minister of Australia, Anthony Albanese. And then I did something that, if I'm being truthful, made my stomach flutter a little. I sent it to him, the full letter, not just a social media post, not just a comment under someone else's article. I formally submitted it to the Prime Minister's office. And today I want to tell you why. Welcome to Not Just a Story. This podcast has always been about lived experience, about the stories behind what we see on the surface, about what happens when someone decides that their experience, their voice, or something they've witnessed is too important to leave unspoken. And this episode is one of those moments for me. Because I'm a survivor of domestic and family violence, I'm also an advocate. And through Healing Through Love, I spend a lot of time talking, writing and thinking about domestic violence. I read the reports. I see the headlines. I see another woman's photograph appear on our screens. I see people say, this has to stop. And then eventually the news cycle moves on until another woman dies and we do it all again. There was one question I couldn't get out of my head. How many more women? How many more women have to die before Australia decides that what we're doing simply isn't enough? According to the Australian Institute of Criminology, 1,773 female victims of intimate partner homicide were recorded in Australia between July 1989 and March 2026. 1,773 women. I want you to sit with that number for a moment, because it's very easy to hear a number that large and stop seeing people. But every one of those numbers had a name. She had people who knew her. Someone had heard her laugh. Someone knew what she liked in her coffee. Someone had probably received a message from her. Someone celebrated birthdays with her. Someone may have called her mum or sister or daughter or friend. She had a life. And then she didn't. That's why I refuse to look at domestic homicide as simply a collection of unrelated tragedies. Because domestic violence is so often about patterns, coercive control, threats, stalking, intimidation, strangulation, repeated breaches of protective orders, escalating behaviours, previous victims, previous police involvement, previous warnings. And yet, too often, we seem to look at individual incidents rather than the pattern surrounding them. That is one of the things I challenged the Prime Minister about. I also wanted to be fair. I didn't write a letter saying the federal government has done nothing, because that wouldn't be true. There has been significant investment. There has been work around information sharing. There has been discussion about identifying high-risk perpetrators. There are national initiatives already underway, and there are also limits to what a Prime Minister can do directly. Australia is a federation. Criminal law, policing, bail and sentencing are largely controlled by the states and territories. Anthony Albanese can't simply stand up in federal parliament tomorrow and change every domestic violence sentencing law across Australia. But here's the thing. He can lead. He can bring premiers and chief ministers together through National Cabinet. He could say, if we are going to call this a national crisis, then we need a national response. And that became the heart of my letter. I asked for action in 5 areas. The first is greater national consistency on how we deal with serious and repeat domestic violence offenders. Now, I'm not suggesting that simply locking people up for longer will solve domestic violence, because it won't. Domestic violence is complex. Prevention matters. Education matters. Housing matters. Early intervention matters. Specialist services matter. Children's services matter. Behaviour change programs matter. Police training matters. All of that matters. But so does accountability. If somebody repeatedly breaches a protection order, that behaviour has to mean something. If someone's behaviour is escalating, we have to recognise escalation. If there is stalking, coercive control, repeated threats or serious violence, we can't continually treat each event as though it exists in isolation. A protection order can't simply become a piece of paper someone is free to ignore. The second thing I asked for was stronger and more nationally consistent restrictions for perpetrators who have been identified as high risk. That could include firearms and weapons restrictions. It could include stronger risk assessment. It could include monitoring in circumstances where it is legally justified. It could mean specialist teams focusing on perpetrators who present a serious risk of lethal violence. Because surely one of the most important questions our systems can answer or ask is not simply what happened today, it's what is this person capable of doing next? Then I came to something I have written about before, a national domestic violence disclosure scheme. South Australia already has a scheme that allows someone who feels unsafe to seek information about the domestic violence history of a current or former partner. And my question is very simple. Why should that protection depend on where you live? Why should someone in South Australia potentially have access to information that someone in another state doesn't have? Imagine meeting someone. You begin a relationship. Things seem good at first, but then things start to feel wrong. There are little controlling behaviours, questions about where you've been, who you've spoken to, maybe jealousy, maybe intimidation. Maybe you start changing your own behaviour because keeping the peace feels easier than arguing. And somewhere in another state, there may already be a documented history of serious violence against previous partners. Would you want to know? I know I would. And I believe people should have a carefully regulated way of asking. I'm not talking about a website where anybody can type someone's name into a search bar. I'm not talking about public humiliation either. I'm talking about a properly controlled system with safeguards, privacy protections, and specialist domestic violence support. Because disclosure on its own isn't enough. If you tell someone that the person they're living with has a history of serious violence, you also have to help them understand what to do with that information safely. And then came perhaps one of the strongest points of the letter. A national domestic violence perpetrator register, or an equivalent national system that ensures serious domestic violence histories follow perpetrators across jurisdictions. Because perpetrators move. People move from Tasmania to Victoria, from Victoria to Queensland, from New South Wales to West Australia. They start new relationships, they build new lives. But if there is a serious documented history of domestic violence, that history should not somehow vanish because someone has crossed a border. I wrote a sentence in the letter that probably sums it up better than anything else. A perpetrator shouldn't be able to find another victim simply by finding a new postcode. Think about what national information could mean. A police officer responding to an incident in Hobart could immediately know that the person involved has a serious domestic violence history in Melbourne. A magistrate making a decision about bail in Brisbane could know about repeated serious offending somewhere else. Authorities trying to protect a new partner wouldn't discover months later that another jurisdiction already had information identifying that person as dangerous. Information changes decisions. Information changes risk assessments. Information changes how police respond. Information can change bail conditions. Information can change the protection given to a victim, and information can potentially save a life. The fifth thing I asked for was faster and stronger national information sharing. Because again, domestic violence is very often about patterns. One police call-out may tell one story. 5 call-outs tell another. A protection order in one state, a breach somewhere else, stalking allegations in another relationship, and previous convictions somewhere else may look very different when you put all of that information together. The system needs to be able to see the whole picture, and this is where I become frustrated, because we already know so much. Australia has decades of research. We've had inquiries, we've had royal commissions, we've had reports, we've had recommendations, we have academics studying this, we have frontline domestic violence workers telling us what they see. We have police officers dealing with it every day. We have families who have buried women. And we have survivors telling us what happened before the violence became unbearable. We don't have a shortage of information. We have to ask whether we have enough political will to turn that information into consistent action. And that is why I wrote to the Prime Minister. I wasn't asking him to wave a magic wand. I wasn't demanding that the federal government take powers it doesn't have. I was saying, lead. Bring the states and territories together. Put these questions on the National Cabinet table. Ask what nationally consistent best practice should look like. Ask whether someone's safety should really vary because of the state they live in. Ask whether serious perpetrator histories are following people across jurisdictions. Ask whether potential victims should have a right to seek information. Ask whether repeated breaches and escalating behaviour are being taken seriously enough. And then tell Australians what is being done. Give us a timetable. Measure the outcomes. Tell us whether the changes are actually keeping people safer. Because domestic and family violence has been called a national crisis, and one of the strongest lines in my letter was this: then govern it like one. If something is genuinely a national crisis, there should be urgency. There should be accountability. There should be coordination. and there should be measurable action. And when another woman is killed, we need to ask more than, what happened? We need to ask, where were warning signs? Did anyone know? Was information shared? Were previous breaches taken seriously? Was there an escalating pattern? Was the perpetrator already known to authorities? Could the victim have been warned? Could stronger intervention have made differences? Could her death have been prevented? Those questions will not bring a woman back, but they might help protect the next one. After I finished the letter, I published it through Healing Through Love. I shared it publicly, and then I attached the full letter to a formal submission and sent it directly to the Prime Minister. I had one of those little moments afterwards where I thought, oh my God, I actually did it. Because advocacy can sometimes feel enormous. You think you need a huge organisation, a political platform, thousands of people behind you. But sometimes advocacy begins with deciding, I have something to say. I have thought about it carefully. I can support what I'm saying, and I'm going to put it in front of someone who has the power to influence change. I don't know what response I'll receive. I don't know whether the Prime Minister will personally read my letter. I don't know whether any of the 5 reforms I've proposed will ever become national policy. I'm not going to pretend that sending one letter suddenly changes Australia, but silence certainly won't change it. And perhaps that's the message I want to leave with you today. You don't have to change the whole world every time you use your voice. Sometimes you simply have to add your voice to the people refusing to accept that nothing can change. I've added mine for the women who survived, for the women still trying to leave, for the women wondering whether what they are experiencing is abuse, for the families who have already lost someone, for the children growing up surrounded by violence, and for the women whose names we should never have had to learn because they were killed by someone who claimed to love them. We should not have to keep asking, how many more women? But until our systems do better, I'll keep asking, because the next woman who dies will not be a statistic. She will be someone. She should have had the right to be safe. I'm Rose Davidson, and this is Not Just a Story.
Thank you for listening to Not Just a Story with Rose Davidson. If something in this episode stayed with you, you're invited to reflect on your own story, in your own way, in your own time. And if you feel ready, you can share your story through the Impactful Voice Project at rosedavidson.com.au. This is a space where lived experience is honored and stories are shared with care. Until next time, your story matters.